Well, it is now November 1st, which means government shutdown apocalypse is now snapocalypse or food stamp apocalypse, which means there's something like a 12% chance that you're not even alive to listen to this video anyway, because you've already starved to death. Or maybe not. A federal judge ruled late Friday that the Trump administration has to keep paying for the program, even though Congress hasn't appropriated any money for it. So who knows? Maybe your life was saved by a district court judge just in the nick of time once again. But in general, some 42 million Americans are enrolled in the program, hence 12% of the population, receiving up to about $1,000 a month in food assistance for a household of 4. Eligibility has expanded in recent years, especially during COVID times, and as a consequence, so have enrollment and spending. In fact, twice as many Americans are now enrolled as were enrolled in 2000, and of course, our population hasn't doubled in those 25 years. And spending since only 2019, the last half decade or so, has more than doubled. $63 billion in 2019, $145 billion in 2023. And as the metaphorical cookie jar to buy the actual cookies is now down to crumbs, as the money for the program runs out because of the government shutdown, the apparent problem is not that 42 million Americans supposedly rely on the federal government to feed themselves. No, the problem is we got to get that dependency pipeline back to full flow. As though the purpose of our government was ever such a thing anyway. I guess I must have missed it. Did Thomas Jefferson write that governments are instituted among men to get you Doritos and Mountain Dew? Or was the point securing your rights to do the do yourself? Of course, the junk food memes are disputed by the program's defenders, but as we'll get to, those are not distortions. Those are norms. But beyond the supposed political need for the federal government to assume the role traditionally filled by neighbors and charity and churches and local community to help those in need, there's an economic myth about the program that's perpetuated too. Oh, it's not just that the food stamp program is the kind and good thing to support. No. It's that it's sound economics too. In fact, we boost our economy through the food stamp program. That was the point of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz this week. If you have skepticism about food stamps, well, you aren't just cruel, but you're an economic idiot, too. Don't you know that for every dollar the federal government spends on food stamps, it generates $1.80 in economic activity? Yeah, call it food stamp math instead of girl math, but it checks out about the same. Now, of course, you can reliably dismiss this claim automatically, not just based on who's saying it. The guy whose actual free lunch program got scammed for $250 million to date. The largest known COVID relief scam there is, but also on the philosophy. Does this idea actually work, or is it like one of those MC Escher drawings where it looks like it could work until you look closer and you realize the physics are actually impossible, like a car powered by a big magnet or a power strip plugged into itself? Because of course, if it were true that every dollar the government spends generates more than $1 in revenue, we should tax it 100% and become outright communists. Rare, mythical, rich communists. The government should take all $30 trillion in our GDP and spend them in its wisest ways. And wow, we'll get over $50 trillion in return. It's an automatic money machine. It's a broken ATM. You put some money in, you get more money out. Why have we been idiotically working so hard for so long? Oh, come on, don't be ridiculous, the program's defenders will say, in much the same way they do about minimum wage. Well, if it is actually easy and effective to require a $15 or $20 an hour wage, why not just make it $1 million bajillion and we'll all get rich quick? Well, because that number is totally arbitrary and made up. Correct. It is not determined by market forces at all. But the same is true for your number. So why is your arbitrary number valid, but mine is not? Likewise, if this theory works for food stamps, as in a government dollar in and a couple dollars for you out, why wouldn't it work for every part of our economy all the time? But even though you can dismiss this claim on its face and be totally correct, I always want to know the details. How does this supposedly work? On what basis are you saying that the food stamps program magically makes money? Unfortunately, Tim Walz did not include any footnote citation, so I have to guess about his source. And since I can't find anything that references that exact $1.80 return number he used, my assumption is the number comes from research done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Services, which often publishes analysis claiming to support figures close to Walls's, something in the $1.50 range. Every dollar of food stamp spending generates $1.50 in value, as though a government agency looking to justify its own existence is going to be objective in analyzing the effectiveness of a program it administers. But all these claims are built on what's called the multiplier theory, a Keynesian economic concept. When we see these numbers, $1 in SNAP spending generates $1.80 or $1.50 in economic activity. That's what's called the multiplier. The basic concept of this theory is that the dollar of government spending generates X value in the country's GDP, or total economic output. And that X value is the multiplier. So what explains the supposed multiplier under this theory? Well, the government spends $1 through food stamps, and that dollar then supports the local grocer who hires employees, and the local farmer who does the same, and the trucker who moves the food, and so forth. And oh, look at all the many places in our economy that dollar went to support. In fact, it generated even more than $1's worth of value. That's the idea. The problem is the entire theory ignores the origin of that dollar. Yeah, the government spent $1, but where did that dollar come from? Either it was taxed, as in taken from productive people, or it was borrowed, and it will have to be paid back. If the dollar was taken, well, then we don't actually know how the taxed person would have spent or invested that dollar otherwise, so we don't know the value that dollar would have created otherwise. Sure, $1.80 might sound good if it was true, and it's not. But it's not actually very good if another person would have taken that dollar and turned it into $5. If the dollar was borrowed, well, that's a debt acquired. And if that continues, eventually productive people will be more cautious with their money because they know either the government will have to tax to make up for it, or the government will inflate the currency to pay off the debt, which means less value generated on the dollar, not more. So the multiplier idea is bunk in theory, but it's bunk in practice, too. Whenever you read about this supposed food stamps multiplier, or just the multiplier concept in general, note the language. Ooh, this model predicts, or this model estimates, or this model suggests, as in hypothetically, in theory, not necessarily demonstrated in reality. Economists and social scientists have tried to measure or even prove this multiplier theory for decades. It is the central economic theory of the New Deal. Just get out of a depression by spending magical government bucks, and poof, all your economic woes will disappear. But conclusive evidence just doesn't exist. An analysis of 24 academic studies on the multiplier theory since 2010 finds a multiplier range of 0.31 to 0.66, as in $1 of government spending generates something like 50 cents of economic activity on average. Now, that is value added. Under this framework, a negative multiplier indicates value lost, but it's not value so large it's likely more than if the consumer just spent his dollar directly himself and it was never taxed or borrowed. According to an analysis highlighted in Forbes in 2014, review of 128 academic papers on the multiplier theory only produced 4 that even attempted the sort of statistical analysis that would rule out flukes as a plausible explanation for any supposed good outcomes. And none of these studies demonstrated conclusively that government spending reliably leads to more dollar-for-dollar economic growth. Well, I guess like the full extent of the economic theory itself, true food stamps have never been tried either. But surely, after this government shutdown, we will finally get it right. It's also very difficult to imagine that the program generates more economic value output than the dollar's input when the program consumes $12 billion a year just to administer. And that's not even counting the fraud, which itself is a multi-billion-dollar annual figure too, and that's only accounting for the fraud that we know about. So government spending is so much wiser than our own spending that bureaucrats are producing over $12 billion a year to offset the cost and not just wasting it. Again, if that were true, we should all be working in government jobs. And if we were, our country's productivity would be unstoppable. It's also very hard to imagine that government spending is so much wiser than the consumers would be alone, when all the empirical evidence says otherwise. Food stamps are leading to worse consumer choices, not better ones. A 2016 study from the USDA itself found that 23% of SNAP purchases were sugary drinks, desserts, salty snacks, candy, or sugar generally, commonly referred to as junk food. That is $23 billion in taxpayer-purchased junk food a year. Now, of course, the natural question is, why is this nutrition assistance program buying this anti-nutrition at all? But even if you do think the treats are warranted, SNAP beneficiaries are buying more junk food as a percentage of total purchases than non-SNAP shoppers. The poor choices are subsidized and made more common through the program. Again, according to the USDA itself, the program is inflated and the purchases are skewed toward the unhealthy, which produces a figure that astounded me when I read it. Something like a quarter of the total revenues for Coca-Cola and PepsiCo are SNAP dollars. They are both roughly $250 billion companies, and so much of that value is built on the food stamp program. Now, of course, both companies produce healthier drinks too. They don't just make Coke and Pepsi. They have a wide catalog, including juices and other things, and they make food too. It's not even just drinks. But I think the question is valid. Why are beverages even program eligible at all? Because if this really is just about simple nutrition, just sustenance for those in tough times, you can drink water for free. In fact, that's probably the most healthy choice for you. Because another thing the multiplier theory doesn't consider, in addition to the origin of that dollar that the government spends, are the secondary consequences of the spending of that dollar. How or on what is that dollar spent? Because a dollar spent on poor food choices for somebody who depends on government assistance for his very existence, apparently, has additional costs later, as in that guy needs health care due to his poor health, due to his poor food choices, because in the most ridiculous irony in this entire issue, those enrolled in the program that supposedly provides critical nutrition, that supposedly protects people from starvation, otherwise, people enrolled in the SNAP program are disproportionately obese. According to a 2021 study from the USDA, again, not from some right-wing starve the poor's ideologue, but from the federal agency administering this program, adult men enrolled in SNAP are more obese than not just other men in general, but other low-income men not enrolled in SNAP by a 5% margin. The same is true for women by a 12% margin. In other words, the food stamp program is not stopping starvation. It's doing the opposite. The evidence suggests it's making people fatter, actually, or at least enabling them to do that to themselves on someone else's dime, which is an appropriate metaphor, too. When the government sells you nutrition, it's actually selling you unhealthiness. When the government sells you help for the poor, it's actually selling you corporate welfare for America's biggest businesses. So when Tim Walz sells you economic prosperity, well, I'd give that about as much credit as his plan for campus security.
I've become friends with school shooters.
So it's not cheaper, it's not healthier, it's not even really helping the poor, actually. The competition for biggest lie here is fierce, but the biggest among them might actually be Tim's, that somehow we all benefit economically from this program too. No, we do not. We would all be much better off and much more helpful to those genuinely in need if the money was just left in our pockets instead. I enjoy lurking left-wing comment sections. I don't troll, I don't interact or participate. I just read what they're saying so I can understand their perspective and what they think. And lately I've read several conversations among progressives planning to get together to cook meals or host community potlucks for those now in need of food, and they angrily condemn DC for failing to fund the program, but now they are going to pick up the slack. But unironically, yes. Don't you think that your dollars are much more efficiently spent yourselves on such a thing? Don't you think the people in need will be more accountable and more honest with you when they can see the people helping them out and know exactly who you are? Maybe they won't scam you if they have a personal relationship with you. Isn't it better in every way to solve these problems locally and voluntarily instead of stealing from the faceless taxpayer? How is this not the preferred solution instead of some regrettable temporary fix? In this scenario, you direct your own money, you help your neighbors who you know and you care about, everyone is taken care of in a locally accountable way, and there is no bureaucracy 1,000 miles away skimming billions off the operation unnecessarily. What is not to appreciate about the tradition of neighbors helping neighbors? But maybe that is the greatest scam of them all, actually, even greater than Tim's tweet or his Minnesota Nice free lunches that weren't. The scam on which so many of us insist or are otherwise deceived into believing that you have to pay the government or that you even need the government at all to help you be a good person. You don't. In fact, the further you are away from those people, geographically and philosophically, the better person you probably are. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on X. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams as live on Wednesday and Sunday nights. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.